Good afternoon, everybody. BOMA Greater Dallas is pleased to present this webinar, Reentry to the Workforce, and we welcome all of you to our program. My name is Christine Lang. I'm the BOMA Greater Dallas president, and I will be your moderator today. Please note that today's call is being recorded and all participants will be muted during their broadcast. However, you can enter a question during today's presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. If you're listening to the audio only and do not have access to the chat box, submit your questions to Steve Bransford at bomadallas.org, and we will address your questions after the broadcast. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our BOMA Greater Dallas Cornerstone partners for their support. April Building Services and AMST Elevator Interiors. Interstate Restoration, LandCare, Mooring Construction and Restoration. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's panel. Mark Wilshire, Cushman & Wakefield and former past president. Anthony Barbieri, Kessler Collins, our BOMA Greater Dallas legal counsel. So the goal for today, or the goal of the BOMA Greater Dallas Reentry Task Force is to offer information to assist commercial office, medical office, industrial, and retail property managers in developing reentry policies for their workforces following the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the lack of scientific information and hard data, this is truly uncharted and unprecedented territory. The information in this webinar is not inclusive and should be treated only as general recommendations and guidance for navigating the reentry process. This information should be submitted for expert scientific or legal opinions, should not be substituted for, let me say that real quick because that's a very important line. This information should not be substituted for expert scientific or legal opinions. BOMA Greater Dallas advises its members to consult industry experts and legal counsel before moving forward. Today, we will review the recommendations provided by the BOMA Greater Dallas Reentry Task Force and answer questions you submitted. There were several questions submitted, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. Now on to the questions. So Tony, this is for you. Reducing risk and minimizing exposure is always a priority for property management. During a pandemic, addressing potential legal issues is as important as keeping the property safe and secure. We recommend you work closely with your legal counsel, insurance providers, and others to protect your property and team. So Tony, your first question is about temperature screening. Is this something that we can do?
Yeah, good afternoon, Christine. Yes, it is definitely something that we can do. When I say we, I'm talking about either from the property management side or from the employer side. But like everything in life, there are some caveats and some restrictions to that. First of all, from the employer side, and this would apply to your tenants, and to the extent that you've got a property management company or you're a vendor and you have employees, this will apply to you as well. But ordinarily, the taking of a temperature for an employee is considered a medical examination, which is prohibited by the EEOC. The EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal government regulatory body that regulates and governs relationships between employers and employees. And so even though taking temperature is considered a medical examination and ordinarily you're not supposed to do it for employees, there is some precedence for this, believe it or not. Back in 2009, when the world was dealing with the H1N1 pandemic, that was the swine flu, the EEOC actually came up with guidelines for taking temperatures of employees. Since COVID came out earlier this year, the EEOC updated and refreshed those guidelines to make them specific to COVID-19. But specifically, you can do so, but you have to also keep in mind that as some states and some local municipalities start coming out with reentry guidelines, they may also be separate temperature taking requirements. Haven't quite seen a lot of those yet. Heard of some theoretically being kicked around, but for Texas, we haven't yet seen any specific guidelines or requirements. So for right now, we're looking at the EEOC. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that when you take the temperature of an employee or get any other health or medical information from the employee or employees, that's all confidential. Whether you take that information and discard it, or whether you keep it in a record or a log, it's all got to be confidential. One other thing to point out is that the EEOC has also said that they may, and I say emphasis with may, consider COVID-19 to be a disability under the ADA. So I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying that the EEOC is telling us that they will come out with further guidance on whether or not it is a disability and in what circumstances someone with COVID-19 is considered to be disabled under the law. If that happens, then from a landlord's perspective and a tenant's perspective, there will probably be additional requirements on what you can do for temperature taking or overall screening. But speaking of overall screening, taking temperature has been widely publicized. Everyone's asking questions about taking temperatures and whatnot. People have asked, what temperature is too high? By the way, the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on whose temperature you're taking. For example, a baby's temperature is different from a teenager's or different from an adult as far as what's too high. There are CDC guidelines on that as well. If you visit the CDC website, they'll tell you. But as far as temperature screening is concerned, that is if your reentry plan relies solely on taking temperatures, the concern is that you're going to miss a lot of false positives, and that's because not everybody with COVID-19 has a high fever, and not everybody with COVID-19 has a high fever for the entire time that they're infected. So in other words, your fever may not be abnormal, or it may not be abnormal right away. In which case, if you're only screened with a temperature test, then that may miss a possible positive test. Probably the better approach is to take a more holistic view of screening and, for example, have questions that you ask employees and people maybe coming to your workplace or coming to your building about whether or not they have any of the other symptoms. Keep in mind, the symptoms are ever changing or ever being discovered. In fact, this morning I heard that the CDC is finally adding to the official list of symptoms people who have a sore throat and who have lost the sense of taste or smell. So keep in mind that these are all issues that are ever evolving. Just a few more things on screening. You can ask employees who are physically coming into the workplace whether or not they have COVID-19 or any symptoms. You cannot ask if their family members have it. The proper question is to ask whether or not they've come into physical contact with someone who has tested positive for COVID-19 or who has symptoms of COVID-19. Some clients have asked me, can they ask just one employee or do they have to ask everybody who comes to the workplace? The answer to that question is if one specific employee has a symptom, or if you have a reasonable belief that they have the disease because they've told you or you've heard that they may have it, then you can signal that one employee out, but you cannot just randomly ask certain employees without a belief that they may have it. If you want to have some type of test, there's plenty of test kits out there. I know there's a little hard to find, but there are a lot out there. Make sure that they are reliable. There's been lots of horror stories where the tests either have way too many, some tests have way too many false negatives or false positives. So if you're going to rely on an actual test kit, try and verify how accurate that test kit is before you put too much stock into it. Let's see. Also, if you have employees that are working 100% remotely, it is not acceptable under EEOC guidelines to ask them if they have COVID-19 or have any symptoms. It's only the employees that are physically coming to the workplace. One last point is that we've all heard there's certain hotspots around the world that have a higher number of tests and higher number of positive tests. It is perfectly acceptable to ask employees or visitors to your building or your workplace if they have traveled to any of these hotspots, and when they traveled, people coming back from hotspots are required to quarantine for 14 days. So it's perfectly acceptable to ask that question as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was very thorough. I like that. So the second question is enforcement of social distancing and masks. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the property management or the tenant?
Well, social distancing is a requirement that we all have to comply with. So, for example, the landlord and the property manager have their set of social distancing guidelines in their workplace, and also with respect to the common areas. Your tenants have social distancing guidelines with respect to their specific premises. So everyone's responsible for complying with it, whether or not you're in the building or whether or not you're just out and about walking around. As Mr. Clay Jenkins has tweeted on multiple occasions, he's caught people at White Rock and Katy Trail not following social distance guidelines. So everyone is responsible for themselves. As a landlord, you are not responsible if your tenants do not follow their social distancing guidelines within their premises. However, most leases require tenants to comply with the law. So to the extent that your tenants are not complying with the law, social distancing, they are in violation of the lease. I have had this issue come up a couple times. We have not yet sent out default notices, but we have actually had some conference calls with clients and tenants about how they have to follow the rules or else they're in violation of the lease and the law. Also, most of your leases allow you to promulgate rules and regulations from time to time to safely and properly administer the building. And so to the extent that you need to publish new rules and regulations to impose the social distancing guidelines in the common areas of the building and whatnot, you probably have the ability to do so through your leases. So keep that in mind.
And is it ever too soon to have a reentry, have everyone coming back?
Well, for everyone's sanity, I would say that it's probably never too soon. But as far as the overall decision, this is going to be a state-by-state, area-by-area decision. And reentry is going to look a lot different depending on where you are. I mean, for example, reentry in Manhattan, Kansas is going to look a lot different than reentry in Manhattan, New York, right? And so it's going to be largely a state-by-state, locale-by-locale decision. It's a balancing test between safety and health concerns on one side, and then opening up the economy for obvious reasons on the other side. Unfortunately, politics is going to get in the way. We just hope that everyone has the wherewithal to make some good decisions, putting aside politics. With that said, I think that if your building or your company does not have a proper reentry program and protocol, then it's definitely going to be too early for you to reenter. For example, I have a client, they're a national retail client, and they operate a lot out of Georgia. And they were telling me last week that even though it's legal for them, it will soon be legal for them to operate in Georgia, they are a little bit reluctant to be the first ones out of the gate because they want to ensure that all their employees are properly trained on the protocols and the guidelines. This company has hundreds of employees in Georgia, so training them and getting them up to speed is not an easy task. The client is concerned about the obvious health and safety concerns to the customers and also the employees. The client is also concerned about making a mishap and having somebody, for example, a customer, take a picture of an employee who's not wearing a mask or not following the guidelines and then posting it on social media, which would definitely hurt the business. So I would have to say that if you're not ready and if your employees are not properly trained on all the protocols, then it may be too early for you to reenter.
Thank you, Tony. Mark, for you, we're going to go over property management. The property management team is the link between the landlord and the tenants. A good relationship with both groups, as well as a strong plan, are the keys to success in any situation. So Mark, for your first question, what is the best advice you can give a property manager during reentry?
Thanks, Christine. One of the things I'm going to start by saying is I don't think this is completely new. I mean, property management was doing this back when ADA first came out, back when sustainability first came out. The industry was changing. There was a lot of information, a lot of government entities putting in standards and rules. Property management digested everything, made plans, lived through it, and now it's all second nature. So at the end of the day, I think that this will be the same thing as well. We'll improvise and adapt. So the best advice I can give at this point is, number one, we all have to operate safe buildings, a safe workplace. And so we can put all of the reentry tasks into that bucket. We also, always balance between a landlord and tenant. Tony mentioned about leases and what leases have, and we can change building rules. We've always had to balance that, and all these reentry tasks can be put into that bucket too. And finally, we communicate. We communicate with our landlords, we communicate with our tenants, with our vendors. We're good at that. And so we can put these into that bucket as well. So if property managers, just keep in mind, we've been there, we've done this, everything will work out, and then these rules start to make sense.
Okay. What do you think our biggest challenge is going to be?
Adapting to the change. I'm sure throughout all this, everybody, every day they've come in, there's been a new task, a new requirement, a new report, a new question from somebody. We've all had to change and on the fly, change things up, close down buildings. So adaptability is the thing I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. What I would suggest here, and this is going to be a plug for the BOMA days, is BOMA is a great organization, has got a lot of resources and a lot of people. What I found, especially going through sustainability, is my BOMA peers were the greatest way to figure out what was going on and what we could be doing.
And it goes back to my theme. If anybody ever read about my theme about connections, BOMA connects us.
Just stay socially distant apart, Kristen.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Wear your mask too.
All right.
So are you making any engineering and security changes?
We're going to make a few changes. One is, after the closure, we put down some set points, turned off some floors. People haven't been in the restrooms for a while, so we're going to make sure toilets flush, sinks flush, P-traps are working. All the temperature set points are there. We're going to adjust our outside air intakes, change filters. We're going to do things like that. We're going to encourage tenants before reentry to come walk their floors, at least the reps to walk their floors and make sure everything is still the way they want it. Look at changes they want to make before they start bringing people back. And finally, I think the biggest change we're going to do is we're putting here at our building, we're going to put training into, or specifically COVID and virus infection training into our engineering and security and janitorial practices. What chemicals to use, what process to use, how to deal with tenants, how to be empathetic, how to do work orders when you've got tenants on the floor, how to stay away. We're going to look at all that and start putting in training. ASHRAE and again, the CDC, they all have COVID-19 parameters. So we're going to be looking at that and trying to rebuild some of our training programs.
Okay. Now we're going into the building access and movement. Controlling building access and movement among individuals will be a challenge during the reentry. Keep in mind, people are creatures of habit and they need reminders and boundaries when establishing a new norm. So, Mark, will your buildings be implementing, going back to the temperature checks, are they going to be implementing temperature checks and face mask requirements upon return?
At this time, I'm going to say no on the temperature checks. We're going to leave that up to tenants and such. We're going to talk to vendors about doing that for themselves. But at the building, no, I'm not going to get to be the policeman and do temperature checks. We are going to educate and go back to the training. We're going to talk to tenants about what to look for. We're going to talk to vendors about what to look for, but I'm not going to try to be the policeman. As far as face masks, we are going to start looking at PPE and wearing face masks. I'm not wearing one right now because I'm talking to a computer, but when I walk out the office and see a tenant, I put one on. And it's not necessarily because I think I need to be protected, but it's to show them that I care and that we do care about safety. So we'll be putting in some gloves and PPE requirements for our day porters, our engineering techs, and requiring some of our vendors who are working in tenant spaces to wear face masks at least. And again, we're all going to follow along with the legal guidelines and what government says that we need to follow. OSHA puts out regulations that say we need to provide a safe workplace. I fully expect as a result of all this COVID-19 stuff that OSHA and EPA and others are going to come out with regulations, say this is now your new norm.
Okay. What are current recommendations for how many people should be riding elevators considered social distance?
I'm going to say that elevators are a fixed size, and I'm not going to be able to change the interior boundaries of it. So what I'm going to say is that we're going to look at, what people feel comfortable with. Right now, so I've seen different guidelines: 1 person, 2 person, 4 people. I think we're going to put dots on the 4 corners, but we're going to tell people, if you're comfortable, get 6 on. If you're uncomfortable, 1 on. We're going to try to encourage our tenants to stagger shifts. Instead of getting everybody there at 8, stagger the shifts so that people come at different times. We don't tell people when to leave for work in the morning with traffic, so I'm not going to tell them when to come on for the elevators, but just stagger it. Look at, if you're not comfortable, we're going to open up stairwells so that they can walk upstairs if they want to. But 22 floors, that might be a challenge for some people. So we're going to try the education approach and tell people, hey, get on when you can. Probably stick to 4 in the corners and go from there.
Okay.
That's one, Christine, that I think is going to change as you go. People are creatures of habit. Even with social distancing, if you've gone to Home Depot or Walmart, they don't always follow it. So it's a matter of what are you comfortable with, and just encouraging people. I think one of the other things that I've seen in all the literature is people saying that, floor wardens can now be social distancing and virus protection resources for tenants. And so they can help educate, they can help remind people. You're going to see it. People are going to want to gather and share stories and talk. And they're probably going to do the same thing in the elevator lobbies.
So what do you think about reopening amenity centers immediately or phase them back, like your fitness centers, conference rooms, conference centers, tenant lounges?
I think right now getting the tenants back to work is going to be the most important. So I think conferences and lounges and fitness centers may take a second priority. Second, I expect to see the counties and cities come out with some regulations on maybe how many people can be in at one time, and take a conference center that used to seat 100. I don't know that anybody's going to want to seat 100 right away. So I think those will come later. We're going to try to phase that in, watch for government guidelines. I know our fitness center, we're going to start watching what the gyms, 24-hour Gold's gyms, see what they do in terms of equipment spacing and cleaning requirements. Do they open up their showers? I don't know that I can trust everybody to just rush down there and do what they need to do. So right now, our owner's taking the approach that those amenities will open later. Cafeteria, sundry shop, coffee shops, things like that. We're leaving it up to those tenants, but what we're trying to do is, stagger the lines, put in some stanchions, keep 6-foot distance in the ordering lines, try to go with online ordering, do different things, but we're working with them specifically on their plans. So what I would, again, go back to is just find each one, work through the specific issue, build your plan, prioritize maybe the cafeteria, the coffee shops, because everybody wants to eat and drink, and then work on the amenities like fitness center and conference rooms.
Okay. We're moving into tenant education. So Tony, this is for you. Many problems can be prevented with strong communication. Tenants want to feel secure and they want to be in the loop. This is an opportunity for property management to establish stronger relationships with tenants. So Tony, our first question is, how should we respond to tenant questions and concerns?
That's a good question. The one thing that to keep in mind, this is some food for thought. The corona world spins so fast. Things are happening so quickly, except if you're sheltered in place at home with screaming children and pets. But for the most part, the corona world changes so fast. So when you respond, be careful about giving out outdated information, and there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So be careful about giving out that as well. One thing I'm seeing is that a lot of tenants are asking the landlord questions that really should be asked of the tenant's legal counsel or of some public health official. but we see a lot of people asking landlord for information as if the landlord's supposed to be the guru of all things COVID-19 for the tenant. And that's just simply not the case. So be careful about getting over your skis when it comes to that. The other thing to keep in mind as far as specific communications, it's as Mark was talking about, communication is going to be key here, and you've got to have a specific go-to person between the landlord and the property manager on one side and the tenant on the other. You've got to be able to ask frequent questions and get information quickly from them, and really able to relay information to them quickly as well. So be sure you've got a good, reliable source from that perspective, especially in the early days of reentry. The one thing that I would also recommend is be very clear on what services you're providing to the tenant as far as PPE and reentry service, reentry issues, and what services the tenant is going to have to provide themselves. We've had multiple tenants ask if the property manager is going to be responsible for providing PPE and hand sanitizers inside that tenant's space. So, ordinarily that's not something that the landlord is going to do, or if the landlord does it, they will probably do it and charge the tenant for it. So make sure that it's clear that when you're talking about providing certain equipment and certain social distancing apparatus, who's providing what and who's paying for what.
How can we ease the concerns of tenants on re-entering?
Well, this is definitely a loaded question. The one thing, I read a lot, and I watch a lot of talking heads going off about the reentry process, and I hear them throw out the word hope. We hope it goes well, and we hope it works out okay. We all definitely hope it goes well, obviously, but hope is not a strategy. Okay, the best strategy is having a good, well thought out plan and protocol, and putting it in place and making sure that everyone is educated on how it works, and make sure that everything is communicated with all the different players. That is the best thing we can do to ease concerns about getting back into the workplace. Part of the things you need to consider as you have a plan, reentry plan, and this is probably a whole nother webinar in and of itself, but you have to have a protocol for what happens if somebody in your workforce tests positive for COVID-19. What is the protocol, not only in the workforce, but also with respect to notifying the landlord and the property manager? And the property manager should have this as part of their plan as well. Again, like I said, the world spins fast in COVID time, so you've got to stay up to speed on all the different changing laws and different guidelines, because it's going to affect how we respond to everything and help ease everyone's concerns. There are lots of other things that you can do. Mark alluded to some of this, proper, hygiene etiquette, making sure there's signs posted about washing your hands and proper washing of hands. Some people are trying to reduce touch points, touchless trash cans, tissues so people can open up doors or whatnot. So those types of things help out. Again, it needs to be communicated as far as who's going to be providing this stuff and who's going to be paying for it as well. And I would also say those of us who are going about having increased environmental cleanup, whether it be in the common areas or in the tenant spaces, if that's part of the plan, and it should be, depending on your building, that needs to be communicated with the tenant, and the tenant needs to understand who's going to be paying for that. And then the last thing on this point would be social distancing measures. Keep in mind that there's no one size fits all for a reentry plan. And so there's no one size fits all for social distancing measures. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about specifically within your premises. You still have to comply with the law. But, for example, we have some clients and some customers or our tenants who are having certain hallways for, what are being one way. That way they avoid people walking past each other and breathing on each other. Well, if you have a tenant who only has one hallway, then that's not going to apply. But you should consider what are some specific social distancing procedures you can have in the workplace and in the common areas to mitigate this risk. Mark talked about the elevators. You should also talk about spreading out your employees so that they are not all sitting next to each other to the extent you can. If you have staggered shifts, like Mark was talking about, that makes that process a lot easier. You should also try and reduce the number of staff who need to be there. If you can have some folks work remotely from time to time. And again, to the extent the cafeterias and the workrooms are going to be open, I'm sorry, the lunchrooms are open, you should consider having time slots for when certain employees can go to those work areas. I'm sorry, go to those break areas, so that way you can reduce the number of people there at once. And go ahead. That's it.
I was just thinking about school all over again when we had first grade goes at 10 o'clock.
We've all come full circle.
Yeah, very interesting. So as we contact our tenants, is there anything we should be aware of any legal issues when we're doing this? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but just, what if the information we give them is incorrect?
So this is always a hot topic, and this, I would say, just because this is a novel coronavirus, we can still take from our prior experiences and use that to help us out here. For one thing, as we talked about, things change so quickly in Corona world. So when you give out information, you need to be mindful of. You should start every conversation with a tenant or email with a tenant by saying, this is the information that we have available to date. This may change, and we are not responsible for notifying you if it does change. And so you should start off every conversation or every communication with the tenant with those types of caveats. You should also, just like in the beginning of this webinar, Christina, you mentioned that this is not a substitute for legal or scientific advice. We should also be mindful of having that message given to our tenants when we're having communications with them as well. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the laws that were enacted, whether it's on the federal, state, or local level, were done so quickly and so hastily that there's a lot of vagueness and a lot of gray areas, and a lot of the language is not very well written. And so, and since there's not a lot of interpretation so far, not a lot of judges have interpreted how these laws are going to work, it's hard to really look at what the precedent is. And those of you who are familiar with law, precedent is everything. And so as you're talking to your tenants about these issues, you need to be mindful that we may not know exactly how some of these laws are going to be interpreted. And so you've got to be careful about that, and you need to couch your communications along those same lines. For example, instead of saying that this is the law and this is the way it is, you might want to consider in some circumstances saying, we interpret the law to mean as follows, or we interpret this ordinance to mean as follows, or we interpret these guidelines to mean as follows. And that way you're not necessarily holding yourself out as being the final, making decision as far as that particular law. Another issue that's come up is tenants have asked landlords to give a blessing, if you will, give an approval of their reentry plan and their internal social distancing plan. And that's a catch-22 from a landlord's perspective, because you don't want to go ahead and bless their specific plan because you don't really know exactly how their workplace runs, and you're not really in a position, like I said earlier, of giving legal advice or medical advice. And so it's important to make sure that your tenants have a plan in place, and it's important to make sure that they devise that plan based on advice of counsel and advice of whatever medical professionals that they need to loop in. But be careful about actually saying, yes, I agree with your plan. It's a good plan. That's not a position that you want to be in as a landlord. One other point, I've seen some property managers send out emails saying, we are here for you, and we are here to provide for your safety and well-being in the workplace. That's not something that you really want to go out and say, because that's a far-reaching statement, and you're not there to provide for their health and safety in the workplace. And I'm not trying to be cruel. That's just from a legal perspective. That's not exactly the landlord or the property manager's job. So be careful about, everyone wants to be, warm and friendly in this time, and as we should be, but we don't want to make promises about things that we're not really willing to do. So please keep in mind the message is everything when you're communicating with tenants as far as overstepping what your legal obligations are doing. And then one other last point about this, and this goes to not necessarily reentry so much as communications with tenants. I have seen a lot of I've seen a lot of rent forbearance requests and rent relief requests that have been agreed to with property managers and landlords, either via text message or via phone calls. And since everyone's so busy, no one bothers to actually write down what happened. And I've already seen this lead to disputes. So from a legal perspective, as far as communicating with your tenants, make sure that if it's any type of modification or amendment to your lease, even if you think it's very simple, like, hey, I'm not going to pay rent by the 1st, I'll have it by the 15th. Make sure you document that in a very clear written instrument. Otherwise, it's going to probably lead to a dispute or possibly lead you to waive your rights down the road if that tenant continues to default. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mark, vendors play a key role in keeping our properties running efficiently and effectively. However, each visit to a different building increases the risk of transmission of any virus. So it is important that vendors are vigilant in protecting themselves and their customers. It is also important to address the working relationship with vendors to ensure the relationship remains strong. So Mark, how are you working with your vendors whose services you have cut back on, if done so?
It's a good question. I'm going to say that vendors are key for any property manager, keeping things going. They're like an extension to staff. So one of the things that we've done is, for those that we've cut back on, is to reach out one-on-one and try to have phone conversations, face-to-face meetings if we're able to, but we really can't sometimes. So working with them one-on-one, keeping them informed of what's going on, what the decisions have been. Then 2, working with them on future plans, when we plan to bring stuff back, how we plan to change it, trying to understand 3 things from their perspective. What can we do? We've gone, for some vendors, we've actually paid half service versus full service. We've tried to keep crews, like our night crew, we've tried to keep them employed and on in the building versus just let them go, try to find tasks that we can do. And just, defer some services down the road and just communicate. And then second, or along all that line, is trying to work with them on when to bring them back. But I would say for anything, for the vendors that we've had to scale back on, is just show some empathy. This isn't something that they brought on themselves. This is not something we asked for. And the one thing that we as managers can do is we can always show empathy. This is a people business. And just try to understand what they are and see where can I help and where can they help. The win-win, I mean, I'm not going to be able to pay for everything that they need, but we can always try to find the win-win. And that comes back to a one-on-one conversation.
So when you do have those conversations with your vendors, what requirements are you implementing for vendor entry into your building?
Most vendors that we work with or working with, PPE, screening employees, trying to put in the right protocols, trying to adapt to, whatever the situation is. Again, I use a lot of BOMA vendors, and there's a plus with that because they are willing to work with you and they're willing to go the extra mile. Many times in the past, when you've needed something, you need something overnight, they'll bend over backwards to do it. So that's what we're trying to do. In terms of requirements, I'm trying to emphasize more guidelines and then requirements. The CDC requires this, or social distancing requires this. Trying to use communication and education, like with our janitorial day staff, we still have them on staff. So working with that contractor to provide gloves, provide masks, extra training, but most of the time, a little bit of extra, a little pizza party here and there just to say thank you. One of the other things that we were able to do is, get a little bit of extra bump in pay for this time period because this is kind of a risky environment for day porters. Little things help. Think of the people that are there. They have families, they have jobs, and or issues and concerns. So how can you work with them? So you won't know that till you have a conversation. We're trying to emphasize safety and consideration of others to kind of wrap up all that. But I will say this: vendors are gold to the property manager. So take care of what you have.
Very good. Going into the janitorial about cleaning, disinfecting, and building maintenance. So during this pandemic, cleaning and disinfecting the building while ensuring the property is being maintained properly is of utmost importance. So, Mark, what is being recommended for cleaning procedures for the building?
First off, keeping up with all the experts and CDC guidelines that are out there, what products to use, how frequently to use them, and that gets into supply. So the first thing we're trying to do is make sure we have supplies. I know Cushman is working to get supplies. Our vendors are working to get supplies. Taking inventories and making sure that you have what you can, and what you don't have, you try to work around with. I'd love to have some more hand sanitizer stanchions around the lobbies now, but I can't get them, so just work with what you got. We are looking at high-touch cleaning in the lobbies, and as the tenants walked out and started working from home, we kept some of that up. We did a lot more high-end cleaning in their spaces in the interim. Some tenants went the whole disinfectant route, one of the Clorox 360 treatment. They did and paid for that. So we're trying to keep up, like Tony said, this is what the building is doing. So in common areas, we're going through and doing the high touch point, garage elevators, passenger elevators in the building, doors, handles, restrooms, access card readers, just, the things that we can do that we need to clean up, security console and things like that. And we're working with tenants to define for them what cleaning means for them. In the past, janitors kind of cleaned it all, did that. We're trying to define now the difference between sanitization, disinfecting, and then deep sanitization, deep clean. So we're trying to define with them what that means and what the building's going to provide and what we won't provide, and go from there.
Okay. Are you considering recurring disinfecting cleans once the building open, or once people start coming back?
I'm going to say that that's going to depend. What is the landlord willing to pay for, and what is his relationship to tenants? What are the tenants asking for? All those are going to be factors. What are the CDC guidelines going to require before we come back? We still haven't really seen all of those plans. We may be required to do that. It depends if you had a COVID case in your building or in a space. You may want to deep clean a building before bringing somebody back on. And finally, it's going to depend upon what your tenants want. If they won't come back until you do it, landlords may do it. So you need to have all those considerations in place. Again, what I'm going to say there is assess and adapt. Our building, we have not closed. We've still continued to clean. And so I don't think we need to take an additional step, but we're willing to listen to tenants and see what needs to be done and make recommendations to them. But again, as a manager, it's going to be understanding from your cleaning company, define disinfectant, sanitization, deep clean, high touch. What are those tasks? If you have that high touch during the day, that's going to take daytime staff away. So if you need to bring on another person to do the regular day porter stuff, you need to talk with your cleaning company about what those definitions are so you can communicate and plan service.
Okay. How about, well, so are you also, when you're talking to your owners, are you recommending cleaning the whole building or just the common areas?
I'm gonna go back and say it'll depend. If your building was shut down or maybe you had a case, that may be something to consider. We've kept our building, clean and ongoing. So we're talking about common areas. So when I start talking with tenants, I'm gonna say, what do you want in your space? Some of our tenants went the full 9 yards and disinfected, cleaned, deep cleaned everything. I mean, you can probably, it's cleaner than a hospital. But we made them pay for it. So, if they're willing to do that, if that works for them. So what we're recommending to our owners right now is that we take it on a case-by-case basis with our tenants.
How are you handling air quality?
Air quality, we're changing our filters at reentry. We're going to make sure that when tenants come in, we've already ordered our filters, so we're going to change those on day one. We're modifying the schedules for, where we can for extra indoor air, bringing it in, looking at those ratios. Again, what is our equipment rated to handle? Our equipment can handle MERV 13 filters. We're going to those. That's what CDC is recommending. We're looking at ASHRAE CDC guidelines. What are they asking for? And trying to follow that. So our engineering staff is engaging with those things to come up with their plan. So in that regard, if your building was completely shut down, you may have more work than if you stayed open. So we're just looking at those pieces. The air quality is going to be based, I get mostly on ASHRAE and CDC guidelines.
Okay. I want to go back to Tony on one little question that we got, and you kind of had answered it, but I think it's good to reiterate. So a person asked, we are currently taking temperatures of all employees and contractors daily and keeping a log of it. They log it, they keep it in the management office out in the open. Do you think, should they be keeping it in a secure place?
Yes, the log, any information you get from the employees about their health, like the temperature, that needs to be confidential. So I would treat that as confidentially as you would treat Social Security information.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I was just there was a question. They might have gotten on a little later, but kind of going back to what you said, Mark, about the elevator cabs. Do you want to reiterate what you had mentioned on the social distancing there and the capacity guideline?
I don't think there's a guideline yet. There are a lot of recommendations. So I think the most common one I see is 4 corners. So put a sticker on the floor of each cab at the corners and put up signage reminding people to maintain social distance, to cover their wear masks or PPE or whatever the requirements are from the county, the government, CDC goes. I think we are going to lean more towards letting people kind of figure it out on their own. If somebody comes up to an elevator and they're super concerned about being too close to somebody, they can take a stair or wait till one elevator at a time. It's going to be a lot to people. I don't know that we want to police and say, no, 4 only, or you must get on this elevator. Don't want to force people onto an elevator if they don't want to be on it. And then we're asking tenants to communicate that with people. Use their common sense, be safe, take the stairs, stagger your shifts, and just work through it. I think that within a week or so, people are going to get the hang of it. They're going to figure out what to do, and they'll have their habits again. And so just take it day by day, signage and stuff, and be willing to adapt.
Okay. All right. Well, that's the end of our questions that we had, and I don't see any other questions. If anyone wants to put any, I can talk a little slowly as I wrap it up here. So thank you to everyone for joining us today and for those who submitted questions. I also want to thank Mark and Tony for their time and expertise. As we mentioned, the document you reviewed is our draft for reentry. The task force will be tweaking the document, and our goal is to publicize the final document by the end of the week. We will also discuss the final document during our May 4th webinar. If you would like additional information, BOMA International has published their reentry guidelines as well. You can find that document on the COVID-19 resources page on the BOMA Greater Dallas website. Our next webinar is on Friday, May 1st, and it will cover using this time for big ticket projects. Information for this webinar can be found on the BOMA Greater Dallas website under the event calendar. Many thanks to our BOMA Greater Dallas Cornerstone partners for their support, April Building Services and AMST Elevator Interiors, Interstate Restoration, LandCare, Mooring Construction and Restoration. Thank you guys again, and have a great week. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.